ESPN's top draft analyst has advice for the Jets, and if they follow it, they will be taking the biggest risk imaginable. Locked On Jets starts now.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Thursday, January 22nd, 2026, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day, and for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. A big shout out to you everydayers. If you're new to the show, this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And our episode today is brought to you by Prize Picks. Download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. On today's show, we're talking about the NFL draft. I think it's a good time on the calendar to take stock of where prospects are rated and who some of the realistic possibilities are for the New York Jets when they pick 2nd overall and 16th overall in the upcoming NFL draft. We are approaching the Senior Bowl, which is another big milestone. So it's a good barometer to see where prospects currently are. And a number of prominent members of the media have recently published mock drafts. So it's a good chance to take a look at what the Jets' options are and talk about how good these options are. We'll begin by talking about Mel Kiper Jr., the longtime NFL draft expert for ESPN, who just this week put out a mock draft, which has the Jets picking Ohio State linebacker Arvell Reese 2nd overall and Alabama quarterback Ty Simpson 16th overall. We talked a little bit about Ty Simpson on yesterday's show, how I would not be surprised to see him rise up the draft boards and potentially be an option for the Jets at 16 or even higher. You know, I don't think you can rule out some team being desperate enough to draft Ty Simpson in the top 10. Quarterbacks tend to rise this time of year. It's a supply and demand issue. I think it's fair to say that the Kiper scenario with Reese at 2 and Simpson at 16 is about as high risk, high reward as it gets. And I have to tell you that I would not be crazy about either pick at this point in time, while acknowledging the upside with these picks. You know, I've talked a lot about potential prospects for the Jets at number 2. You've heard me talk about Ruben Bain. Yesterday, I talked a bit about David Bailey. Arvell Reese is another name that's been thrown out a lot, and I haven't really mentioned him on this show. But it's not necessarily that I think Arvell Reese is a bad prospect, but I think that there's a lot of risk involved. Yeah, I think the ceiling is really high with Arvell Reese, but it's not clear what his position is in the NFL. I think there are a couple aspects to this. Number one is at Ohio State, he hasn't played edge rusher a lot. You know, he's been used in a bit of a hybrid role. This year was really the first time he was used even part-time as an edge rusher, but he plays a lot of off-ball linebacker. And with his frame, you know, it's not entirely clear he's going to be able to hold up at off-ball at edge. Now, I mean, you know, David Bailey's not very big either, but Bailey's been an edge rusher, whereas Reese has, again, played a lot of off-ball linebacker. Another thing that, you know, going through the film, and look, I want to be crystal clear about this. You know, I want to be transparent. I haven't gotten through all the film yet, but I have started to review these prospects and develop opinions on them. And Reese just does not pop off the film the way Bailey does or the way Ruben Bain out of Miami does. And I think that while his ceiling is high, it's unclear how likely he is to meet that ceiling because of what he's done so far, because of his role, and because it's not entirely clear what his position is. You know, I think if you draft Ruben Bain number 2 overall, there's a good chance Ruben Bain's going to be a really solid player, if nothing else. You know, he's a guy who can get after the quarterback. He can play the run. He can slide inside. He can play on the outside. You know that you're getting an all-around good defensive lineman in Ruben Bain. You're getting a guy who's probably going to be able to do it all. David Bailey is not quite as well-rounded. He's a guy who, you know, we don't know how well he's going to hold up against the run. But in today's NFL, it is a passing league. I know it's a cliche. I know you hear it over and over, but winning is correlated with passing the ball and stopping the pass. And David Bailey may not have the all-around game of Ruben Bain, but his floor as a pass rusher is really high. There's a really good chance that David Bailey is going to be a good pass rusher, and he has the tools to potentially be a great pass rusher. I think the same is true of Arvell Reese, but there are all these question marks. And one of the luxuries of picking number 2 overall is that you don't have to choose between high floor and high ceiling. I think you get to a certain point in the draft and maybe you roll the dice on a guy who has a super high ceiling, a guy who, you could potentially be a star, but you worry about whether, he's got whether if it doesn't work out for him, he'll even be a productive player. At two, you don't really have to do that. At two, you can get players who are both high floor and high ceiling. And I think it's fair to say that Bain and Bailey are both high floor, high ceiling guys. Of course, there's no such thing as a bust proof prospect. It's always possible, someone doesn't pan out, but the odds are really good of these guys being quality players because of their skill set, because of their history of production. With Arvell Reese, you're really just making a projection, and it could very well work out. I would be comfortable drafting Arvell Reese at a different point in the first round. But at two, this is the point where you should take all risk off the table. So I'm not wild about drafting Arvell Reese number 2 overall. And if I'm not wild about drafting Arvell Reese number 2 overall, I'll say I'm adamantly opposed to drafting Ty Simpson 16 overall. And I know we have some Alabama fans who probably listen to this show. Of course, the greatest player in Jets history was an Alabama quarterback, Joe Namath. But I think there are some serious questions about Ty Simpson's game. I heard one defense of Ty Simpson is that, well, if he didn't play the second half of the season, people would view him in a better light. That's true, but he did play the second half of the season. And the more data we get on a player, the more complete of a view we've got. I mean, I'm not convinced on Ty Simpson's ability to run an NFL offense right now. I'm not convinced on his ability to deal with a situation where things aren't functioning at a high level. I saw a lot, I watched him a lot near the end of the year. I felt like he really struggled, especially when he faced adversity, when he faced pressure. I don't know that he's a guy I would trust at pick 16. There's a point in the draft where I would consider taking him, but I feel like 16's at that point where you still might be in range where you feel like you're committing to a guy for multiple years. I just don't think I saw enough out of Ty Simpson to say that I'd be comfortable with the Jets committing to him for the next 2 to 3 years. I think that, if you pick him later on in the draft and you're not that tied to him, I could see selecting him. But part of my concern is that if the Jets draft Ty Simpson, that it's not really a pick that's based on a long-term view of the franchise, that it's either maybe ownership intervening and saying you need to draft a quarterback, or maybe it's the coaching staff feeling a little bit of heat and the front office feeling a little bit of heat and thinking, you know what, we got to get a quarterback in here who could be a long-term solution because we don't have much time. Maybe we're on the clock. And these are the situations where teams make grave errors. This is the type of grave error that you see front offices and coaching staffs who start to feel pressure. And I firmly believe that the two most important spots on the field are quarterback and edge rusher. I think quarterbacks, well, nobody's going to really debate that quarterback's the most important spot on an NFL team. But I think edge rusher is really the most important spot on the defense. It's either that or a shutdown corner, but there just aren't that many shutdown corners who currently exist in the NFL. Another projection we'll talk about in a little bit has the Jets trying to find one. But there's upside whenever you draft a quarterback and an edge rusher really high. Notwithstanding what happened in the divisional round and the wild card round, the Houston Texans largely turned their franchise around based on drafting a quarterback, CJ Stroud, and an edge rusher, Will Anderson, high in the first round, both 2 first-round picks a couple of years back. It can turn your team around, but you have to pick the right guys. I'm not really convinced that either of these are the right choices right now for the New York Jets. I think that they both have really high bust potential. And I know everybody's got bust potential to a degree, but I see some pretty glaring red flags with both of their games. I can't say I'd be entirely comfortable with the Jets picking either player. Would I understand it if they did? Sure. Would I root for them if they did? Sure. Would I hope I'm wrong if they did? Of course. But that is a draft scenario that would raise a lot more questions than would find answers for me. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll take a look at a different draft scenario. And this has the Jets filling 2 of their biggest needs on either side of the ball. They're not addressing quarterback in this next scenario, but they could end up really improving their team. We'll discuss that as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. What if sports were traded like markets? Now you can put your sports IQ to work in real time with Robinhood prediction markets. It's not you against the house, it's you participating in a live market. You can buy or sell your positions live all game long. Use your sports knowledge in the moments that matter. Robinhood prediction markets changes the game. It's people moving the action, so when momentum shifts, you can move with it. I always knew the game but never had a dynamic way to apply that knowledge. Now I can actually take part live in a market powered by people. You're no longer just a spectator. Play by play, you decide. Trade every play with Robinhood. Now available across the US. Download the Robinhood app now to begin. Futures and cleared swaps trading involves significant risk and is not appropriate for everyone. Event contracts are offered by Robinhood Derivatives LLC, a registered futures commission merchant and swap firm. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. The NFL playoffs are in full swing, and there's nothing like being at the game, the crowd noise, the energy, cheering alongside other fans. Watching at home is great, but being in the stadium hits different. The frustrating part has always been getting tickets, waiting in queues, dealing with logins, and watching prices change right at checkout. And that's why the Game Time app gives the advantage back to fans. It's the hack for unlocking amazing NFL tickets and experience in a few taps. I've used Game Time myself, not just for NFL tickets, although I did go see the Jets play against the Denver Broncos in London this year using Game Time. I've used it to go to the US Open Tennis. I've used it to go to the Holiday Bowl in San Diego a few years back. Used it to go see shows on Broadway. I've always gotten amazing deals at the last minute. I also like that they give you the view from your seat, a picture of what it's going to look like from your seat, so there's no surprises, no obstructed views you weren't expecting when you arrive at your venue. Take the guesswork out of buying NFL tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDONNFL, Locked On NFL, for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today and get back to being there live. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. If you have not already, go check out our new Everydayer Club. It includes access to an ad-free audio feed for Locked On Jets compatible with Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and every other major podcast app, along with an invite to the members-only Locked On Everydayer Club Discord server. Go to LockedOnNYJets.supercast.com or tap the link in the show notes to learn more. And today on Locked On Jets, we are focused on draft scenarios for the New York Jets. We are just before the Senior Bowl, and that's going to be a big event. Senior Bowl practice week is a week where players increase their stock. You get to go head to head with some of the best prospects. And if you're off the radar, it's a real opportunity to catch the attention of NFL teams. And many scouts will tell you that the practices, the week of practices leading into the game, can be more important than the game. You get to go through the drills, you get to work with NFL coaches. It's a real opportunity for players to make a move. So right now we're focused on where players' stocks are heading into the Senior Bowl. And we're looking at a couple mock drafts because they kind of lay out the scenarios the Jets may be dealing with. Our next mock draft is from Pro Football Focus, and they have the Jets drafting David Bailey, the edge rusher out of Texas Tech, #2 overall, and Denzel Boston, wide receiver out of Washington, with the 16th overall pick. This is an interesting scenario because I think it really addresses two needs that the Jets absolutely have to fill. And of course, our first scenario, which involved edge rusher and quarterback, was also filling two pretty important needs. But I would be really intrigued by this scenario for the New York Jets. I talked a lot about David Bailey on our show yesterday, and he's the guy who I really struggled to come up with flaws for. You could say, there's questions about how sturdy he will be in the run game. Can he set the edge? And, those are valid concerns, but the ability to get to the quarterback makes up for a lot of flaws in a defensive player. I talk a lot about Will McDonald's issues against the run, and they exist, but the big problem is Will McDonald's just not generating pressures at a high enough rate. If Will McDonald got to the quarterback at a really high rate, his inability to stop the run would not be as big of a deal. And you can find other players on your defense. You can kind of cover for a really good pass rusher who struggles against the run. You can upgrade the personnel. You can around him. You can scheme things up. I think David Bailey's got a really high floor, and I hesitate to use that phrase because it implies like there's no chance he's going to fail as a pass rusher in the NFL. And of course, we never know exactly how things are going to pan out, but I think the odds are really high that David Bailey's at least going to be a good pass rusher in this league. And we talk about the prospect most likely to be an elite guy. And I'm talking about somebody who can throw up a 15, 16 sack season, somebody who could get himself into all pro consideration. I feel like Bailey is the guy with the best odds of the edge rushers in this class. I think Ruben Bain out of Miami is the guy who's most likely to just be a good all-around player. I think Bain's like the lowest risk. We talk about who's going to be a good all-around player, but we talk about just who's going to be a top-notch pass rusher. I think Bailey is the best bet on that front. And on the defensive side of the ball for the Jets, we're pretty much starting from scratch. I talked about this a bit yesterday, and I struggled to come up with who the best player is on the defense right now. A year ago, we could talk about two guys who had been all pros in the past, Quinnen Williams and Sauce Gardner. I think that, you can make a case that right now the most reliable defensive player is Ja'Wan Briggs, a guy who, was traded for a late round pick swap at the end of the preseason this year. A guy who, started the year as a rotational defensive lineman for the Jets. And yeah, I like Ja'Wan Briggs. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say anything against Ja'Wan Briggs, but, where else would you go? I mean, do you think Jermaine Johnson's going to bounce back? You hope, but you can't count on it. I mean, I think Will McDonald has a lot of empty calories in his stats. You could point to Will McDonald 10.5 sacks last year, 8 sacks this year. But I think if you watch the games, McDonald's just not an impact player. At the corners, I don't really trust the guys the Jets have. I certainly don't trust the safeties the Jets have. Quincy Williams is probably on his way out the door and had a terrible year anyway. So, you got to rebuild this defense. And I think more than anything, you need premium players. You can't get super picky about where these guys play. I mean, I do have some hesitation about taking like a safety, Caleb Downs, number 2 overall, but you can't be super picky if you can find a great player. All the better if it's a great player at a premium position like David Bailey is. David Bailey can be a guy who potentially is a number 1 pass rusher. And I think that he's potentially the type of guy who could be the type of defensive player who makes opposing offensive coordinators stay up late at night, trying to come up with schemes how to stop him. That's the kind of guy the Jets need. I'm not sure the Jets have had a pass rusher like that in 20 years. The last time the Jets had a pass rusher who really gave opponents nightmares was John Abraham. They've had some good pass rushers since then. Calvin Pace had a couple of good years. Bryce Huff had a 10-sack season in 2023. Jermaine, of course, went to the Pro Bowl in 2022. But I don't think the Jets have had that truly elite level pass rusher since Abraham. They've had great corners, Revis, Sauce Gardner, Antonio Cromartie, DJ Reed. But they haven't had that pass rusher off the edge. Interior linemen, they've had really good guys. Muhammad Wilkerson had great seasons. Quinnen Williams, of course. Even Sheldon Richardson, Leonard Williams had some decent years. But they haven't had that edge guy. They've had players everywhere else except the edge in the last 20 years. And David Bailey could be that guy off the edge. And the second guy that PFF mocks to the draft, a guy who's ironically named Denzel Boston, could be coming to New York. Boston profiles as a big receiver. He's kind of a contested catch sort of guy. He's not a burner. He's not a guy who's likely to produce a lot of big plays because he runs past the other team's corners. But he could be a big play guy in the standpoint that he can get up in the air and make plays down the field. Garrett Wilson has some very pronounced strengths. There are a couple of weaknesses, and I think one of the weaknesses we know is that Garrett is not particularly skilled at being strong at the catch point. Garrett is not a contested catch guy. He doesn't need to be. One of the things that's important to understand about wide receivers is that there are all sorts of different types of wide receivers who can be successful in this league. Garrett's a guy who has kind of an unconventional route running style, and he just creates separation really easily. It's as effortless as any wide receiver in the NFL. Now, you get into the red zone. I think a lot of quarterbacks would like to have a big guy they can go to, a guy who's kind of like a human throwing lane himself, a guy, you can just throw the ball up to and trust that he's going to be able to go get it. Denzel Boston out of Washington, he could potentially be that sort of guy. He could be a guy who complements Garrett Wilson really well. And more than anything, I think there are certain styles of wide receiver you'd like to pair with Garrett Wilson, and, a bigger type receiver, a guy who's strong, a guy who can win the ball in the air at the catch point. That certainly would be something that would be helpful for the Jets. But more than anything, you just need quality, because this is a team that did not have I'm going to keep repeating it. I've said it over and over this offseason, but I think it needs to be repeated again. The Jets did not have a 400-yard receiver last year. And I fully acknowledge, obviously, Garrett Wilson's a 1,000-yard receiver if he's healthy, but they don't have anybody good after that. I mean, Adonai Mitchell looks like a backup receiver. I'd be happy if Adonai Mitchell breaks out, but that's different from saying we should count on Adonai Mitchell breaking out. After that, I mean, John Mechie had 2 good games and then really struggled to catch the football from there. Arian Smith really did not show anything as a rookie. Maybe he'll develop into a good special teams coverage guy, but I didn't see anything that suggests to me that Arian Smith's going to be a high-end wide receiver, even a quality starting receiver, even a quality backup receiver. So, I think that no matter who it is at 16, that's a spot that's very likely the Jets are going to look at the wide receiver position because they need a lot of help there. But of course, they need help in other spots. Ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll look at one final scenario. Could the Jets, a team that has struggled on offense forever, focus exclusively on the defense in the first round? It's possible. Would it be the worst idea in the world? That's worth some thought. We'll give it that thought as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Indeed. If you've ever hired someone who looked good on paper but was not the right fit, you know how important that is. When you want candidates who truly match what you're looking for, trust Indeed sponsored jobs. Hiring? Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites. Indeed sponsored jobs put your post at the top of the page and helps you reach the right candidates faster. If I needed to hire someone for this show, I'd go straight to Indeed and be very specific about what I need. Real experience, not just a resume buzzword. Instead of struggling to get your job post seen, Indeed Sponsored Jobs helps your listing stand out and reach quality candidates faster. Sponsored posts boost your job to the people who are the best match for your role, and that makes a real difference. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed are 90% more likely to report a hire than non-sponsored jobs. Spend more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with less stress, less time, and more results using Indeed sponsored jobs. Listeners of this show get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job the premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL. Just go to Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Do it the right way with Indeed. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by TurboTax. Tax season does not have to take over your life. This year, TurboTax is making it easier than ever to just hand things off and move on with your day. With TurboTax Full Service, you can have your taxes done for you by a trusted local expert, start to finish, without the stress or guesswork. Instead of spending hours trying to figure out forms, you can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person or connect online. They handle everything from W-2s to self-employment forms and work to get you every deduction. You can upload your documents, go about your day, and get updates right in the TurboTax app. It's a huge time saver and gives real peace of mind knowing an expert is handling it. And for a limited time, you can have your taxes done by a TurboTax expert for just $150 all in. If a TurboTax expert did not file for you last year, just file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life. Visit turbotax.com/local to book your appointment today. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. Today we're going through potential draft day scenarios for the New York Jets. We are approaching the Senior Bowl, which is a huge point in the calendar, particularly as draft evaluation season moves on. And it's a good chance to take stock of where players are and at least where we stand right now, who potential picks are for the New York Jets at number 2 and number 16 overall. Our last scenario has the Jets focusing exclusively on the defensive side of the ball. This is a mock draft SB Nation put out this week. It has the Jets picking Arvell Reese, number 2 out of Ohio State. And at 16, the Jets pick a corner, Avion Terrell out of Clemson. And just to be clear, you could probably assume it anyway. All of these mock drafts we mentioned today have Fernando Mendoza, the quarterback out of Indiana, going number 1 overall to the Las Vegas Raiders. Mendoza, of course, won the Heisman Trophy and led Indiana to a completely unexpected national championship. So I think that we can bet that in a world where the Raiders somehow pass on Mendoza number 1, the Jets would pick him at number 2 overall. And if there was a world where the Raiders were even willing to trade out of the pick, I think the Jets would move up. I think the Jets would be very interested in moving up, and the Jets would have a huge advantage in trying to move up because if the Raiders weren't interested in Mendoza and the Jets moved up for him, Raiders would get the 2nd overall pick from the Jets, and they'd still get their choice of the non-Mendoza players. But, of course, we're expecting Mendoza to go to the Raiders. It would be the upset of the year if Mendoza was not picked by the Raiders. So Jets are going to need to look in a different direction. This one's an interesting one because it's all defense. And when the Jets traded Sauce Gardner and Quinnen Williams, my working theory was that they were going to reallocate their resources because the Jets are probably drafting a quarterback early either this year or next year. Now, the odds of it being next year went up when Dante Moore returned to Oregon. I think if Moore came out, he very likely would be the choice for the Jets at number 2 overall. But it's also possible the Jets pick a quarterback, if not at 2, maybe at 16, as we discussed a little bit earlier. If not at 16, maybe with one of their 2 second-round picks. Or if not, then they got 3 first-round picks next year. I think we can guess that it's very likely the Jets are going to pick a quarterback with one of those selections. And would be something of a surprise to see the Jets do this. We talked about Reese a little bit earlier on the podcast. I'm uneasy about him at 2. He could be a great player. I'm not saying the pick would be destined for failure at 2, but I would say that this selection has a lot more risk than I'd like it to, particularly with options who at least on paper look safer in terms of pass rushers for the New York Jets. The big eyebrow raiser, though, is Avion Terrell at 16 overall. And the reason for that for me is that, we're not just talking about failing to reallocate resources from defense to offense. We're talking about the Jets using a pick they got for Sauce Gardner to pick a corner. And this is where I have a little trepidation about what the Jets did trading Sauce. This is the Sauce Gardner trade got rave reviews in this fan base. It got a ton of positive feedback from the national media and analysts all over the place. And you may remember at the time, I was trying my best to find the logic in it. And I could talk myself into it, but the trades left me very uneasy. I'm going to be honest with you. I think the Jets traded 2 great players away for draft picks. And if the logic behind it is we're going to just reallocate resources, we're going to take those great defensive players, turn them into draft picks where we'll use to draft offensive players to help our next quarterback. I don't know how well it's going to work, but I understand the logic. I struggle with the big picture vision of trading Sauce Gardner for 2 first-round picks and then needing to use one of those 2 first-round picks to replace him. And I like Avion Terrell as a prospect. Avion Terrell actually, in some ways, resembles the head coach he would have if the Jets drafted him, because he's kind of undersized, but he's got he's a good cover guy, really feisty, loves to tackle, very physical, good man-to-man skills. Sounds a lot like Aaron Glenn as a player. I don't have an issue with the prospect. I have an issue with the big picture thinking if the Jets do this, because it's a lot to ask him to be as good as Sauce Gardner. Now, I will acknowledge that Jets got 2 first-round picks for Sauce Gardner, so they still have an extra first-round pick next year from Indianapolis. Terrell also will cost less. Sauce Gardner was going to have a $30 million contract, which I don't think was a bad deal for what he brought to the table, but obviously Terrell would cost less money. So it's not just the picks. You do create extra cap space. But still, I look at this, and I do think corners are really important for the defense that I believe Aaron Glenn wants to run. At the time we are recording this podcast, the Jets still have not made a hire for defensive coordinator, but Glenn has suggested that he's going to look for someone who runs the principles he believes in. And the principles Glenn has believed in through his coaching career are very aggressive defensive style, lots of blitzing, and lots of leaving corners one-on-one. And this was one of the question marks I had about trading Sauce Gardner, is that to run a defense like that, you need a number 1 corner you can trust. I don't think the Jets right now have the personnel to run the type of defense Glenn wants to run, and they have deficiencies at the corner position. And, in theory, in that sense, Terrell's a logical pick, but you traded the corner who was perfect for the system. Sauce Gardner was having it was one of those things that flew under the radar. Sauce Gardner was on his way to having another all-pro year before he was traded to the Colts, and then, he got injured early in his Colts career. I think that the Jets certainly lack the defensive talents, that we talked about it. I can't think of a Jets defense personnel-wise that's ever been in shape this bad. I mean, they really have no pieces on that side of the ball at the moment. So, I couldn't get mad at them for picking 2 defensive players. And, if you're not picking the quarterback until 2027, that gives you an extra year. So maybe you can use some of your premium resources to build up the defense this year. But man, I just keep coming back to the question: why would you? I hate it when NFL teams do this, when they trade a great player and then they draft a player at the same position with the pick they got for him, because the pick's not going to be as good as the player you traded. It's one thing if you can't afford a player. It's one thing if again you want to reallocate your premium resources and maybe focus on another area, like the Jets did when they traded Jamal Adams. Everyone forgets about this because of how terrible his career ended with the Jets and how much he fell off in Seattle, but Jamal Adams was a great player with the Jets. They just said, we need players that play different positions than safety. We have a safety. We have nothing else. So they traded Jamal Adams. They ended up getting a couple early picks, one of which turned into Garrett Wilson, the other of which turned into Elijah Vera Tucker. That's one thing. It's one thing if the Jets trade Sauce Gardner and add a premium receiver. They add a good prospect at another position. I really struggle with the idea that the Jets should take the Sauce Gardner pick and turn it into a corner, even though I like the corner. I think he's a good prospect. But we'll see what happens. I think that would be a weird move, though. That would raise a lot of questions for me. I don't know if maybe they wouldn't for you. Let me know in the comments. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.